Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to the terrifying Vaughn Manor, where Roger and I have returned to talk about horror. We were just hanging out, and we were reading The Willows by Algernon Blackwood, one of my favorite writers. There's Algernon Blackwood there. That's Algernon Blackwood. One of my favorite writers in The Willows, one of the greatest horror stories ever written. I love horror, and I love the writers of horror. I love Algernon Blackwood. I love Arthur Machen. I love Edgar Allan Poe. I very much love H.P. Lovecraft. He's my favorite. I even like this Stephen King guy. They're some of my favorite writers of all time. I love horror. I love horror fiction. Classic horror fiction in particular, but I love horror. And considering my worldview, some people have wondered about this throughout my life. Why would a guy who thinks like I do love horror? And this requires a little explanation. Because to talk about horror and why I love it, in part I have to talk a little bit about myself, just a little, and my own particular worldview. And in doing so, I'm not trying to convert you to it. I'm not trying to get you to believe what I believe or whatever. This isn't that kind of channel. I just talk about books. But I do have to talk about what I believe and the way I think and my particular worldview to talk about this subject. So, first of all, I don't believe in anything supernatural. The supernatural does not exist. Now, some of you may point out that I live with an undead mummy that I resurrected using sorcery. But I'm sure there's a perfectly rational explanation. I mean, there's gotta be, right? Right? Yeah. There's a perfectly rational explanation for that. Because the supernatural does not exist. I don't believe in anything supernatural. I think when it comes to the real world, outside of our imaginations, when it comes to the real world, it's important to know as best you can what is real and what isn't. That is sometimes very hard to do. Surprisingly hard sometimes. But I think it's important. And so I try to believe, true things as opposed to false things. Which means I do not believe in the supernatural. It has no part of the actual world or the universe as it actually functions. And if you want to know how the world and the universe functions, or you want a beginning understanding of it, how it actually works, I always recommend an introductory biology text, an introductory geology text, and an introductory astronomy text. They'll tell you most of the things you want to know, and they won't say God did it anywhere. Why? Because there's not the slightest, tiniest bit of real evidence that God actually exists. Or any gods. There's a lot of evidence that human beings created a whole bunch of gods, but there's no evidence that gods of any kind actually exist. None. Zero. So I am an atheist. Why wouldn't I be, considering the complete and total lack of evidence for a deity? So nothing supernatural. I don't follow any religion or religious beliefs. Don't believe in God. I do not believe in the immortality of a soul or a soul at all. There's no evidence, again, zero, that human beings have souls, or that anything has souls, immortal souls that exist past the demise of our bodies. No evidence, and biologically speaking, souls are completely unnecessary. So I don't believe in those, and that discounts ghosts for the most part. Ghosts don't exist. I know a lot of people believe in ghosts. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter how many people believe something, that doesn't make it true. You would think, after all of these years of human beings believing in ghosts, there would be some actual evidence to support them, but there's not because there are no ghosts. So there. That is my worldview without trying to get anybody converted. I don't care what you believe, honestly. This is just where I'm coming from. Now, considering all of that, why do I love horror? And in particular, weird horror. Horror that frequently depicts the supernatural. I was one of those kids who used to watch Scooby-Doo, a very rational cartoon, full of things that actually exist. Teenagers acting stupid, dogs that talk, and fiendish monsters that, turn out to be just real people in disguise. And I was one of those kids that was always disappointed at the end of Scooby-Doo. It was like, can we get some actual monsters or ghosts once in a while? I would appreciate that because I always loved monsters. Since I was a little kid, monsters fascinated me. I loved them. And I've always been interested in horror and horrible stuff. So of course I'm going to be attracted to stories like stories by Edgar Allan Poe and Lovecraft and all of those guys. Because despite what I actually believe exists in the real world, I have a very strong imagination, which comes out a lot when I read. I can get, unless an author just sucks, I tend to be able to get completely immersed in a story to the point where I feel like I'm experiencing it. And I just find horror fascinating. Supernatural horror also. I love that stuff. I love vampires and ghosts in books. They don't really exist, either of those things, but I love them in books. All kinds of monsters, all kinds of horror. In fact, I tend to prefer monsters as opposed to like serial killers. Serial killers, pretty much bore me to death. They actually exist. Who needs those? I like monsters, Now, true, one of my favorite horror authors, H.P. Lovecraft, had a similar worldview to mine. Not totally, but when it comes to that kind of stuff, he was an atheist and a rational materialist. He didn't believe in any supernatural anything. But he wrote a lot about it in his stories. But eventually he started giving scientific explanations for his monsters. His later stuff was a lot more science fiction than supernatural. And it worked because it was still all horrifying. An unfortunate thing about life is that there are things in life, most things in life are far more terrifying than you will find in a horror story or a horror novel. Disease, for example. Disease seems mundane because it's so commonplace, but it's a terrifying thing. And it's one of those awful things, as we know from, the past few years, that can just unexpectedly strike and bring anyone down. What a terrifying thing. This is far more frightening than some of the things you'll find in horror stories. And I think some of the things that are going on in horror stories, if you're somebody who's fascinated with horror and interested in horror, it's a place, when you read these stories, horror is a place where you can work stuff out, where you can experience awful things safely, because, the things in horror, except for The King in Yellow. Don't read that. That'll drive you insane. But, if you're just reading a regular horror novel or horror story, you're pretty safe, Nothing in here is going to kill you. Although I think Rhonda was actually... Rhonda, were you buried in a pet cemetery? That would explain some of her behavior if you were buried in a pet... No, I don't believe that. Were you, Ron? She could have been. Anyway, it's a safe place to work some stuff out. And it's fascinating. And it allows you to experience horror and chills and thrills, you know, in a way you wouldn't normally, because, you know, a lot of this stuff doesn't exist. And so it has great appeal, and it has great appeal to me. I mean, I love all kinds of different types of books. Science fiction is actually probably my favorite type of book. If I were absolutely forced to read only one kind of book in the world, it would probably be science fiction, but thank goodness I'm not bound to only read one thing. I could read all kinds of things. And right after science fiction and adventure-y type stuff, horror is right in there. Love it. Love it. My imagination allows me to just really immerse myself in it, experience it, and in some way, it helps me, I think, cope with all the awfulness in the real world, because the real world is full of awfulness and terrible things and incredibly difficult loss and all that other rotten stuff that exists in the real world. Listen, I'm not a fan of the real world at all, as you might have noticed. I try to ignore it as much as possible, but like I said, when I have to deal with the real world, I would like to deal with it in the real world, if you know what I'm saying. I don't want to bring my fantasy world into the actual world where I have to exist. But thank goodness horror fiction exists, because very often I think I need it. I need it, I think. Right, Roger? Yeah. Roger totally agrees. My supernatural mummy brought back by sorcery completely agrees. There's a rational explanation in that somewhere. I'll figure that out. Okay, guys, I'll shut up now. I will catch you next time.